everyone, welcome to today's Crossroads. Thank you all so much for joining us, whether you're here live or you're watching the recording later. My name is Dr. Alyssa Adams. I'm a research scientist at Cross Labs, and I will be your host for today. The Crossroads series is run by Cross Labs, a research institute in Kyoto, Japan. We're supported by Cross Compass, who is one of the leading AI companies in Japan by Cross Labs. The overall goal of Cross Labs is to understand the mind through computational research. We explore ideas about brain science, AI, information science, artificial life, changes in society, open-endedness, and all sorts of other cool topics. Every month at Crossroads, we talk about intelligence and what parts of the sciences can help us understand a little bit more about what they are, how they're part of the rest of the world, and how we might recreate them from scratch. The cross in Crossroads refers to the bridge between many different disciplines in AI and alife, as well as the bridge between industry and academia. Because you know what? It takes a lot of different perspectives to tackle these big questions. So this is our monthly fun forum where we invite cool and exciting speakers from a wide variety of backgrounds to share their research and to have an exciting discussion on these topics. We'll have a Q&A after the talk, and we'll post a Slido link that people can use to ask questions, or you can simply ask them in the YouTube chat. We'll watch them there. Now, without further ado, I'm happy to introduce our speaker. Today we have Dr. Ken Stanley. And Ken Stanley has an amazing career trajectory, which has been so inspirational for so many people. He's now the CEO of a new social media company called Maven. And previously, he's been the Open-Endedness team leader at OpenAI, the head of core AI research at Uber AI, founder and co-chief scientist at Geometric Intelligence, Charles Millikan Professor in Computer Science at University of Central Florida as well. And he's invented a lot of different software algorithms, including the famous NEAT, HyperNeat, ES HyperNeat, CPPNs, and Novelty Search, and a whole bunch of other ones, including Poet. He's also the creator of PickBreeder, Galactic's Arms Race, Petals, and many more. He's also an author with Joel Lehman of a new book called Why Greatness Cannot Be Planned. Why Greatness Cannot Be Planned, The Myth of Objective. So, hello, Dr. Ken Stanley. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're so excited that you're here. How are you doing?
Good. Yes. Good to see you, and thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining. We're so excited. And you're currently in beautiful San Francisco, right?
That's right. I'm in San Francisco.
Nice. That's so good. Well, I guess everybody's really excited to see what you have to say, and everybody's really excited to hear about Maven and of course your work on open-endedness. So I'm just going to go ahead and hand it over to you. The floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Alyssa, and thank you everybody for giving me this opportunity to share a little bit of how I ended up involved in starting a social network. Even though I'm coming from the perspective of an AI and alife researcher. So I kind of wanted to tell you guys that story a little bit. I'm assuming a lot of the audience comes from alife or AI backgrounds, and we'll probably hopefully find interesting how that background for me leads into doing something that probably you wouldn't predict for me to do. And so I thought I would start by just telling you about my primary research interest. And this is just to give a kind of a sense of what was motivating me throughout my career as I moved in the direction that I did. It's really what I would call open-endedness. And that refers to processes that continue to innovate and discover indefinitely and without bound. And this term open-endedness is not one that I would have necessarily used all the way from the beginning of my career. At some point in the middle of my career, I kind of realized that that's a really good way to crystallize all the things that I'm interested in sort of a single term. But I've realized at that point that really that's the thing that's really inspiring me. And so what does that actually refer to, processes that innovate and discover indefinitely? Well, it refers to, I think, like the most grandiose processes that exist in the universe. There's really two canonical examples of this. One is natural evolution, just an incredible open-ended process, which is represented by this tree of life on the right here. And it's just the idea that you start with some very small set of of artifacts or interesting options, like a single cell, and then it diverges and increases in complexity over eons, more than 1 billion years. And in that, which is remarkably a single run of sort of like an algorithm, all of living nature is invented in that one run. And that includes things like us and the human mind. Human intelligence is one of those inventions, but there's some other impressive ones there, like photosynthesis or flight. And I point that out because like diversity is one of the really big aspects of open-ended systems. Because when we think about optimization algorithms, or the algorithms that are popular in, for example, the field of artificial intelligence, we generally think about things where it just produces one thing at the end. It's like, that's the final product. Now, it might be an impressive product, but it's basically one product, maybe a couple products. Nobody knows how to make something that would produce something like all of living nature in a single run. This is just an unprecedented and incredible creative manifestation, which we still struggle to reproduce computationally or anything like it. And so why, from an artificial intelligence perspective, I would find this important is just because, look, it's the way we got human intelligence. Like, there's only really one route so far to get to human level, and that was through an open-ended process. And notice when I say open-ended, like what I mean is that there's no final destination. Like, the longer you run it, the more interesting it gets and the more diverse it gets. In fact, the longer it goes, the more possibilities there are, because if you are at the beginning and there's only a single cell, well, the next generation is going to be all single cells. Like, you're not going to get that much interesting stuff relative to what you were at in the previous generation. But you go forward 500 million years and suddenly you have many, many starting points. And you go forward another 500 million years, you have even more starting points. And so the opportunities and the possibilities are actually increasing as time goes on. This is divergence, which is very different than typical AI or ML algorithms, which are more convergent. They go to the solution and then they're over. This is the complete opposite. We don't know where it's going, and it never ends. And so the other canonical open-ended process that I think is a good inspiration to highlight is civilization, which I represented here as a process that similarly brings you from simple, maybe humble beginnings like fire and a wheel and wheels, early inventions, to things like space stations and computers. Today, over not 1 billion years, but thousands of years in this case, many thousands of years. And this is another like epic branching, diverging process. Like the longer it goes, the more interesting stuff there is. Just like with natural evolution, and it's not converging. There's not like a single final invention where it ends. I just want to emphasize that we're not just talking about technology either here. I mean, every single thing that humans have come up with is part of civilization. So that includes art and music and political ideas, literature. So all of these things are encompassed by the idea of this ever branching and diverging set of ideas, which are basically life as we know it. That's what created the world around us that we spend the most time inside of, are the products of our own imagination. And so even though it's not explicitly, maybe it's not definitionally evolution, obviously it shares this open-endedness property with evolution, and it has this divergent property. And the longer you run it, the more complex the artifacts become. And also, the later in the process, the more interesting opportunities there are, because those things that were most recently invented are more complex and diverse and sophisticated than what we had 1,000 years ago, for example. So there's more things that can be invented now. And so we have these two processes. And this civilization process is interesting also with respect to intelligence, because it's our output. It is the output of human intelligence. So, in some sense, it's like there's an open-endedness sandwich with us in the middle, right? Like, I mean, there's a process of open-ended discovery that produced us, and then we produced this other process of open-ended discovery. So openness is all around us and has a lot to do with, in my view, what it means to be human because of that, and also how you get something like intelligence and what something like intelligence really is. In other words, like if you think about intelligence, like what is the most salient aspect of human intelligence? To me, it's this stuff. It's the outputs that are inventive and creative. It's not that or you could solve a problem on a test. I mean, I could give you a math problem, you might be able to solve it. That's an analytic kind of intelligence, important, but not the most salient aspect. The most salient aspect is just the creation of the world around us. And so like without that, I mean, I think you're a far cry from something that you would call human level. And this is why I think it's important for us to learn to capture what kind of artifact can actually push the cutting edge of civilization itself. And so that is not, I think, today's AI. Like today's AI does some very impressive things compared to a few years ago, but it's not a participant in the cutting edge of invention yet. And so this remains out of bounds. But these are the things that inspired me, and as interested in intelligence, how we could eventually get to things like us. We need to understand open-endedness, and we probably also need to create open-endedness because it creates things like us. It's probably worth mentioning that this kind of process is obviously also interesting to artificial life and not just AI. I alluded to AI a lot because I'm very strongly interested in artificial intelligence, but I've also really been interested in artificial life. And sometimes the border between these two fields is a little bit fuzzy anyway. But obviously, when you look at processes like the tree of life, you're looking at a natural process. And I've always been fascinated by how natural processes can create astronomical complexity. And to me, this is not just an AI issue. This is an alife issue. Astronomical complexity I'm really interested in. It inspired me to do like the NEAT algorithm. I was interested in complexification, things that over time get more complex. And that was what I was attempting to do in the NEAT algorithm with neural networks. And so I think the alife angle on these kinds of processes is equally fascinating to the AI machine learning angle. And that's why, there is a community, obviously, within alife, which is the open-ended evolution community, which precedes the interest in open-endedness in AI. In fact, just as a historical note, I was hanging out with the open-ended evolution community back in the day, before anybody was really talking about open-endedness in AI or machine learning. And I had a thought at some point, I can't remember when exactly, something like eight years ago, maybe 10 years ago. But I just thought, you know what, this is actually what I'm interested in, this open-endedness. And everyone should be interested in this. It was like an epiphany. I was just like, why is this niche community in alife? Like there's only people talking about this. Like this is like relevant to the entire field of artificial intelligence. And I decided to take the word evolution out of it, not because I don't like evolution. I mean, tons of my work is within evolution. But if you look at like the process of civilization, it's not strictly evolutionary. And by the way, I don't care about semantics. You can say it is or it isn't. It doesn't matter to me. Call it whatever you want. But my point is I want to be able to communicate with people outside of the strictly open-ended evolution community and get them interested in open-endedness. So I started to just talk about open-endedness all the time, every chance I got, every time I gave a talk. I was just really gung-ho about open-endedness. I realized that's the thing that really captures the essence of what I think is so interesting. And now you'll hear about it in artificial intelligence and machine learning as well. There's an open-endedness team at DeepMind right now. I was leading the open-endedness team at OpenAI, so clearly they had an interest in the area. And so now it's broadly discussed. And I think both communities probably could still learn a lot from each other. All right, so now you know something about me and what I'm interested in. And so what I was doing in this field, over my career is just inventing with great colleagues a lot of algorithms and other things relevant, like representations that are relevant to open-endedness. And I mentioned NEAT, or the neuroevolution of augmenting topologies. That was like the beginning of really being interested in, and I was really focusing on increasing complexity, also preservation of diversity. CVPNs are an artificial DNA-like thing. There was an experiment called PickBreeder, which is an experiment in open-endedness, and on, novelty search. And so we just kept doing things. call it chromaria, because I did that work with Lisa Soros, who I believe was actually a part of Cross for a while as well. And you could just see, just kept going through my career, like my interest in this stuff, like the paired open-ended trailblazer. We even managed to get the word into the name of the algorithm there for poet. And so I've been long interested in this stuff. And I wanted to just now highlight one of those things because it's going to relate to how does this lead to creating a social network, which is the big question at hand for this talk. Like, why would you do a social network with all of this? And so some long time ago, this probably came out around 2007 or something like that, we created this pick breeder system. And you know, at first, like if you've heard of pick breeder, like it sort of seems like it's a toy or a game. Like it's basically a way to breed pictures. Like you can select images from a set, and then that image will have children. Those children resemble the parent to some extent, and then you can select from that set a new parent, and then it'll have children, and so you can iteratively breed. Maybe like you might breed horses or breed dogs or something like that. And people were breeding things in the system, and you know, there's actually this one important property that you could breed from someone else's discovery. So like if someone had bred like a skull, then I could branch from that skull, sort of as depicted down here actually, and you could just get new stuff that's related to that. And so people were branching from each other's discoveries, which was kind of cool, and that's why we end up with this kind of phylogeny. Now, what does this have to do with open-endedness? Well, what it has to do with it is, you know, it's not really just a game, even though like a lot of people who used it may have seen it as a kind of a game. But to me, like I was really interested in it because it is connected to this idea of seeing open-endedness in action. And you have to understand that like what's really intriguing about open-endedness is that we don't know how to actually create it. It's similar to AGI in that sense that it hasn't been achieved yet. And so it's a kind of a holy grail pursuit to actually try to create something that's truly open-ended in the sense of like nature or civilization. And so to get traction on it, like to understand how can a system like this actually work, intuitively, it made sense to me that we should try to get some kind of artificial open-ended process going so that we can observe what its properties are. And I didn't have a sense of what they would be. I didn't know, but I thought we would learn something for sure, something deep probably. And that's really what Pick Breeder was. It was really an attempt to get an open-ended process going. But I call it here an attempt to cheat, because the thing about it was that actually, we don't know how to do open-endedness. So we need to cheat to get an open-ended process, and the cheat is to put humans in the loop, because humans already have that property. I mean, we created civilization. It's intrinsic to us and our intelligence that we search divergently. And so we can piggyback on top of the human mind, which is a pretty big cheat. I mean, the human mind is like a big element here that's making this work. But within that framework, then we can create an open-ended process, which is what this kind of phylogeny represents. And all these images were discovered. And, you know, it's worth noting that these are incredibly unlikely needles in a haystack. Like in this search space, it was like 99.99999% just meaningless blobs. So the people inside of this were truly finding needles in a haystack consistently. And it was a really interesting process. And it did actually teach us a lot. Actually, so it leads to some new algorithms. But actually, I want to go back here and just point out what insight this actually shows, because it was like a kind of a mind-blowing insight at the time. We went back through these histories, try to understand how did people find these things, how do people find these individual images, and it turns out that there was a principle in there that was very counterintuitive, which is that it was always the case in almost every single case that people only found things when they were not looking for them. So most people listening may be familiar to this, but if you're not, I should say it again because it takes a minute to absorb that. The people who found things were not looking for them. So the only way to find things is to not be looking for them. And this was a revelation. You know, it's very counterintuitive and paradoxical. And it's actually deep at the heart of why open-ended systems work. They work because they're not trying to find something in particular. Like as soon as you set an objective, you actually destroy your ability to search open-endedly. And it's also often destroys your ability to even achieve your objective. So this is because of the property of deception, which is that the things that lead to, for example, the skull don't actually look like a skull. So if you were looking for a skull, you wouldn't like those stepping stones that lead to the skull, and you wouldn't have the skull. But you'd also just get stuck, and you wouldn't have anything else either, because all you care about are skulls. And so you have to not be looking for these things in order to find them. And this made me think a lot, noticing this revelation, that what does this mean? At first, I was thinking algorithmically. What are the algorithmic implications of something that crazy? I mean, it's a really strange point. And I just want to point out that if I tell you that the only way to find things is by not looking for them, that, if it's true, is an absolutely devastating indictment of a number of fields, including, generally almost all of machine learning. Because generally you set an objective and move towards it. I mean, that's how it works. That's how it works. Like, that's how algorithms work. And so at first, there's some question about, like, is this just some very pick breeder specific insight? It's not really about, life in general. But actually it is about a lot more than just pick breeder. It's about everything basically works this way, even though you may not have thought of it that way, which is the sort of devastating insight here. That, like, when we're in very complex spaces, the stepping stones that lead to things that are interesting to us do not resemble those things. And therefore, an algorithm which is focused only on achieving those things will fail actually to find those things. And the way that we can find those things is by being open-minded or open-ended, and actually just choosing things to pursue only because they're interesting, not because we know where they're going. That insight led to this, like, let's make an algorithm, the novelty search algorithm, that tries to follow this principle. So it's very counterintuitive, like, of an idea, but it was, worth trying to formalize it and say, like, would this possibly work? And so the novelty search algorithm, like, was said, like, let's not search for the solution to something. Let's not explicitly formalize what the goal is in the algorithm. Let's only try to produce behaviors that are novel. And there was this, like, well-known experiment in the maze, one of the early experiments, where it solves the maze. It gets a robot that can go through this maze, even though it doesn't actually reward getting to the end of the maze. It's just because it keeps on finding novel destinations until it solves the maze. And so a lot of people are probably familiar with this image, this hard maze became. I'm very surprised all the places I've seen the hard maze on the internet since that time. This hard maze became almost like its own little icon. And so the novelty search algorithm did demonstrate that this principle makes sense in practice, but I want to emphasize that it's not really, it's a little misleading for me to describe it as a way to solve a problem like the maze. The maze is a very constrained environment with very few things that you can do. The real deeper lesson here is, like, often you won't be able to solve something intentionally. It's not that novelty search will solve your problem. It's just that nothing will. The advantage of novelty search is not that it will solve a specific problem, but that it will do something interesting. Whereas trying to solve the problem won't do anything at all because it's deceptive. And this, of course, is only true in very complex problems. Like modest, mediocre problems, objectives work perfectly fine, which is why we believe in them so much, perhaps misleadingly. And so this got some good amount of interest in evolutionary computation and artificial life communities. But what was kind of weird here, this is where things sort of take a pivot, is that people started to ask about what it means for them personally. Like, that's a really unusual plot twist, for an AI project. Right? Like, when has anybody ever asked, like, well, what does backpropagation mean for me personally? Like, I just don't get these kinds of questions usually in these fields. But this was like that because people immediately saw the connection to their own life, because people were said, wait a second, I have objectives. Like, what, should I not have objectives? Like, is that actually, like, a bad idea in general to have an objective because it's deceptive? If it's ambitious, and then I'm actually dooming myself to failure and also ruining my ability to explore. And that message was interesting enough that it brought me to this is actually a picture of this auditorium at the Rhode Island School of Design, where I spoke to a bunch of artists. Like, someone who had seen me talking about novelty search said, oh, these artists at this school would probably find what you're saying interesting. You should go here. So I go to this school, and I give this talk, and it was a really strange experience for me because I never talk to audiences like artists. So it's a really strange thing. But it was really like a transformative experience for me because the meetings that I had afterward, they gave me an office and they let people sign up for meetings one-on-one. And in those meetings, I saw people almost crying. I mean, I saw genuine catharsis happening. I saw people on the verge of tears. I was really in therapy sessions with people. And that's when something clicked because, why were people almost crying from a computer science idea? It's because they were saying to me, I've never been able to justify what I'm doing to my parents or to my teachers. Like they always want to know, what are you trying to accomplish with this pointless stuff? It's like you made this image or something, but it's completely pointless. How are you going to make money? What is the purpose of this thing? Their lives tend to be frustrated in this way, which is probably different from people who have more of like engineering or computer science backgrounds. And somehow in what I was saying, they saw a justification for why what they were doing makes sense. Because I would emphasize, like I always emphasize, that the alternative to the objective path is the path of the interesting. And it is principled to follow a path because it's interesting without knowing where you're going. That's what the successful pick breeder users were actually doing. And they're the only ones who found all those really cool images. Anybody who came in and wanted to find an image would fail. It was the ones who were following the path of the interesting who found all the amazing stuff. So the artists were saying, that actually justifies what I've chosen to do with my life. And that made just something click for me that I just realized that, this is like a really important message socially. It's not just an algorithmic point here. I mean, I had glimmers of that in my mind before. I understood, intellectually, that like, okay, if objectives can be bad algorithmically, then maybe they're not so great in real life either. But this is what really crystallized it for me, was just seeing this emotional reaction. And so I was, after that, I was just started to think like, this needs to be a broader conversation. Because if you think about it, it's like all of society basically runs on objectives. It's everywhere. And it's not just personal. It's not just your objectives. It's the objectives of the government, of your university, of your companies. Like everything is objectives. What does it mean if it's actually unprincipled when we're doing very ambitious things, or if we want to get to innovation? Which is why Joel Layman and I, who was a PhD student under me, decided we should write this book. This came out in 2015. So this is the trajectory that led to the book. The book, Why Greatness Cannot Be Planned, is not really a computer science book. Obviously, it draws heavily on that research, but it's really meant for the general public because we wanted to start a conversation, a bigger social conversation. You could think of it as social critique in a way, although it also has elements of self-help in it as well, and technical elements as well. So it's very hard to categorize what kind of book this is. Nobody could ever, if that was a problem with publishers, nobody could figure out what is the genre of this book, but it doesn't matter to me. It's just a full explication of the whole idea. I wanted to get it out there so that we could have a conversation about it. And as you can see, it later came out in China actually last year. So there's the Chinese edition. You can see the butterflies evolved. It looks a little bit different here. So we came out with this book, and we wanted to actually have this conversation. And I was very, I felt very determined that this is an important thing to do, even though my incentives didn't really align with it. For example, at the time I was a professor, and just writing a general book like this, not like a publication in computer science, isn't particularly rewarded on a career path. And so it was written really, and in some meta story, non-objectively. Like I just thought that this was a very interesting thing to do, and I just have to do this. I was very motivated after having this kind of revelation after talking to the art students. And so we wrote this book and we put it out there. Like the kind of slogan of the book is, to achieve our highest goals, we must be willing to abandon them. And think about it in terms of great ambitious things that we might want to do. If we want to cure cancer, achieve AGI, create limitless sources of energy and save the environment, like these kinds of things, the stepping stones that will lead to those things may not be those things. The cure for some disease may not have anything to do, or a stepping stone towards that cure may not have anything to do with researching that disease. Someone could be researching some exotic tree somewhere, and it happens to have a chemical that turns out instrumental. That's the nature of complex spaces. The things that lead to the images in PicReader don't look like those things. They're something else. They're interesting for other reasons. And so we have to have this ability to abandon objectives. So we start this conversation. And so this is a weird story now. It's getting really weird, I think, because like it's very unusual as an AI researcher or an alife researcher to have this kind of branching in your story, career story. What happened to me because of writing the book, which you may not know, is that I became like a focal point for objective discontent. It's like every person who is really unhappy with the way that the world works, with the objective straitjacket, the tyranny of objectives that just surround us and suffocate us in our lives, came to me to talk about the problem, to complain about the problem, to think about what could be done about the problem. People want to be free of the objective straitjacket. And I started to be exposed to this very explicitly. Society needs an escape because of everything being objective. There's very little room for serendipity in the way that the world works. Because serendipity requires not having a plan. After all, serendipity is about unplanned greatness. That's basically what serendipity is. So it's like something great happens that you weren't planning on happening. Okay, so then if you are constantly inundated with you must do this to achieve that, where can you then just go explore for the sake of exploration? And we see it across every institution. Like I said, it's like the National Science Foundation or science funding in general, corporations, educational institutions, government institutions. They set like lofty national objectives, local objectives. This represents philanthropy. Philanthropy works through objectives. Even your love life works through objectives, because if you do go to a dating site, it'll probably ask you what you're looking for, and that's your objective. And so you are completely saturated in objectives, no matter where you go or where you look. It's personal, professional, whatever it is, everything is objective. And it's a huge problem because there are so many things in this world that will be discovered because somebody followed the path of the interesting, and they're thwarted at every turn because of this. And I became this focal point for people to talk about this. And so what happens is that, over years, because this came out in 2015, I just got to sit there. And so like a parallel life, like while I'm doing all my AI research, and just talk to people and absorb the feeling of how people feel about the way things work. And it was like this kind of like basin filling up with some toxic substance over many years. Because at first I just talked to them. It was very exciting to talk to people about stuff that I never thought I'd be talking about with people, or the type of people I didn't think I'd be talking to. And I talked to so many different types of people. There's a huge diversity of different walks of life, and also different levels, like everything from high school students to people running billion-dollar institutions. I started to get this like rising sense of discontent, in that like something needs to be done. Something needs to be done about all this, because one thing that started to be clear to me was everybody feels powerless. And this was something I didn't realize at first, that like a lot of people in institutions that make decisions about the allocation of resources, like what to explore and where to explore, actually believe the message of the book. They think that there needs to be more empowerment of serendipitous exploration, but they feel that they can't do much to change things because they feel that they answer to a power structure that doesn't allow for that. And it doesn't matter where they are. It's like you could talk to the director of the lab, who's basically like a gatekeeper for billions of dollars, and they still answer to somebody. Like they answer to Congress, or they answer to the investors, or they answer to the board of directors. Like everybody feels they answer to somebody, and that the people that they answer to will not accept something where they just say, oh, well, we're just doing this because it's interesting. We're just going to explore because exploration is good. They all feel that they just can't just do that. And so that causes a like a real problem in society that is impossible to solve, like because everybody feels powerless. So what can be done? And so so I started thinking about this, like what can be done? Is anything that can be done about this situation? And I was thinking, like this picture depicts kind of the thinking here. I just had this thought. This is sort of around 2022. I mean, because this took years for me to really start thinking like this. But I was like, what could be actually done here, like at some like large scale level? And so like the what the picture is saying is, look, this book here, and the ideas that we're talking about, it's a function of these inputs, which are basically like actually algorithmic experiments. In other words, this is not like a personal philosophy that I came in with. This is not like a social critique, really. This is a development that comes out of grounded, concrete, technical insights from empirical experiments, basically. And so I was thinking, well, if that's true, it's not just social critique. Shouldn't it be possible then, like when you think about where should this lead then, to then go back to grounded, concrete, technical, empirical type of systems? Can't we just bring it back to a system that would then actually embody the ethos of the philosophy in the book, since after all, it originates from concrete, technical systems? And I was thinking about this. And so I was thinking, well, what is that? What looks like something like that? Well, I thought, okay, well, that's basically some kind of serendipity network. Like it's a network which works in the way that the book advocates, where people would be exploring based on interests, instead of trying to just optimize towards some far off goal, which would be an objective version of the world, which is basically the way the world works right now. And so, I realized that, like, you can't change the way the whole world works, like reconstruct all the institutions in the world. But online on the internet, you could create a network that works that way. And it's basically like wrapping a quality diversity or algorithm around humans, or QD with humans in the loop is a way to say that. Like put one of these open-ended algorithms around human beings. And like the diversity of this algorithm would be in the interest that people have, because people have diverse interests. And quality is still like any quality diversity algorithm, which is like where kind of novelty search when it sort of developed into this field of quality diversity. Like any quality diversity algorithm also has some notion of quality. And I thought, and this is getting into sort of technical nitty gritty, but that a minimal criterion would be a very well suited to this kind of domain. I won't go into all the details why, but it sort of relates to the fact that the minimal criterion does a lot of interesting things at scale, and it's very simple, because it's actually really hard to measure quality of subjective content, like text that people write or something like that, or just images in general. And so, there's all this work that had been done with minimal criterion, like there's a minimal criterion coevolution, and it gets increasingly complex as it goes. It's a very simple algorithm. Chromaria that I did with Lisa Soros, it showed minimal criteria actually creating divergence over a long evolutionary runs. I thought we could use that here in this system, like some kind of serendipity network. So I started to come together as there's a way of thinking about this that actually could be a network. And then I thought, oh, but wait a second. You know what? Like if I'm thinking about a serendipity network, like that's basically like a form of a social network, right? Like if there's people in a network and information's moving back and forth, then that's like what social networks are. And then I thought, well, but wait, then that's interesting, because I hadn't really been thinking about social media, but isn't social media then actually part of the objective paradox? An objective paradox meaning this idea that you can't actually achieve things if you're trying. Because like attention, this idea of measuring quality through likes and follows is a very objective notion. Like that's a gradient, that's an objective gradient of supposed quality, and it's consensus driven. And so, to what extent are the unintended consequences of doing the whole world this way? Because basically, like the whole world online works through likes and follows now. It's like an unbelievable tyranny of objectives. To what extent would you expect the unintended consequences under the why greatness cannot be planned philosophy? Like, would it predict that we get all the bad things that have been happening? Like, for example, we have clickbait and toxicity and echo chambers and personal branding, bullying, disinformation, narcissism, amplification. Like all these things are a function of this system, which is supposedly just there to optimize quality. And of course, if you believe that actually these kinds of objective gradients are deceptive, then that would lead to the prediction that you would get unintended consequences. It wouldn't necessarily tell you what the specific ones would be, but the fact that there's so many of them is expected, actually. because the quality of content is not actually an objective concept, and measures of it are very deceptive. It's ultimately a subjective question: what's actual quality? What's transformative to you cannot be decided through consensus. In other words, like, imagine like there's something that could really change your life if you were exposed to it. We can't just get 1 million people to vote and decide what that is. It's idiosyncratic to you. So like the whole way that the system works is something that we would expect to lead to convergence because of consensus, because of its objective nature, and all kinds of unintended consequences. And this was very interesting to me when I thought of that because it said, you know what, like what I'm thinking about here could be a counterpoint, a natural counterpoint to all of the crap that's going on in the social media world, and in the world of the internet at large, because it's the way the internet is basically dominated by this concept. And it's not, at least what I thought the internet was going to become. Like I thought it would be like a playground for serendipity when I saw the early internet. And it's not that right now. It's a giant popularity contest. Every single thing that we do is measured based on whether people actually like it more or less. Whether you have more or less followers. Like that's what determines where content goes. There's a tiny 0.1% of everybody in the world who actually has a megaphone day in and day out setting the conversation for the day. This is basically literally true. I mean, like on X, I understand that there's about 0.1% of the population has 10,000 followers or more. And so, below that threshold, somewhere around there, it gets a little hard to actually get your ideas out there, to interact with people. And we're not hearing from those 99.9% of the world in most of our daily interactions, even though there's a lot of interesting things that those people could say. I think you would agree that 99.9% of the world is not completely bereft of any interesting ideas. And so, this is an opportunity to do something about the situation. It sort of occurred to me that like follows naturally that like this objective tyranny exists in the online world and actually has distorted and perverted what the internet could have done and been. And if just one other like metaphor to think about, what we live inside of right now is as a perpetual popularity contest. It's like every single thing you do is been subjected to a popularity contest. It's a really crazy thing if you think. It's like if you're in a conversation on X, every single part of that conversation is rated and ranked based on likes. And so it's a competition of the most cynical Darwinian nature on every single thing that anyone says in any conversation. I mean, could you imagine if all your interactions were like that? Like if you're sitting at the dinner table and people were pressing buttons to decide which comment was better, this would have an unbelievable pathological effect on you and on society. But this is what's happening. In fact, like a perpetual popularity contest is basically just what we call a junior high cafeteria. I mean, that's the ultimate popularity contest, right? And so like what we've created is basically an international, worldwide, eternal junior high cafeteria where we're now trapped inside forever. This doesn't seem like the actual intended consequence that we wanted for the internet. And so I feel like, okay, the idea of the serendipity network, motivated by actual understanding of quality diversity, which wasn't present in the original founders of these networks, which, by the way, I'm not saying something bad about them. I mean, how could they know? I don't actually think that like Mark Zuckerberg explicitly was like cynically thinking he's going to create some kind of tyrannical system, like just because there was a like button. These are unintended consequences. We are discovering them now. But now we have a chance to reflect and go back and say, well, what could have we done better? And equality diversity is just a good metaphor for like what we actually would have wanted in the world. So that's what led to the social network Maven. And we use this slogan, follow interests, not influencers, to, I guess, put it into a nutshell, like what I just explained in much longer than a nutshell, or just basically say that Maven is your social media detox. It's like you're in an addictive situation. That's what likes and follows are. They're very addictive. This is the path out of that addictive experience, because it may feel good to inject that heroin, but it's obviously not good for you, and you know it. And it's killing you inside. And that's actually the situation. And so while the transition out of it can be jarring, ultimately it can be liberating. And so this is a giant experiment in human in the loop open-endedness at world scale. And I would say like an escape from these perverse incentives that dominate everything. And so, you know, like I said here, like think about cultural progression. Like I wonder sometimes why culture seems to have slowed down. You know, why is it that, you know, something like rock music, you know, used to have a new genre every 10 years. You know, you had the classic rock, and then you had the glam rock, and then you had the grunge, and somewhere around the year 2000, this just stopped. Like I don't understand why the things I listen to on the radio now sound like they did 25 years ago. You know, in my parents' generation, what they heard on the radio sounded crazy to them. Like they could never have imagined like that this was where music would go. You know, to like when like in the 1990s versus the 1960s, just an unimaginable amount of change. But for me, it's like the opposite. I'm like, where's the change? I was expecting to be shocked, but I'm shocked in a different way that I'm not shocked. And I'm wondering, I'm suspicious that like the ultimate aggregate convergent property of having this kind of like-based economy across the entire world actually is affecting the way that culture progresses in a really regressive way, and stopping these kinds of processes from happening in their natural way. Clearly, you can find some interesting things on YouTube or so forth. Like I'm not claiming that there's no serendipity is going to happen at all, but it tends to be things of mass appeal. Like if you find something that is really novel that you weren't aware of before that you actually enjoy, it's probably something that most people enjoy. Like it's very unlikely you're going to find something that's very unique to you that isn't like of great appeal to many other people. And this is a problem for getting that diverging tree of life within any kind of domain. So I think like Maven can be a way to address these issues. It's like an experiment, giant kind of social experiment in this. But clearly it is really, this is what I want to emphasize for this audience. It's very influenced by, you know, artificial life, artificial intelligence, open-endedness in particular, ideas over the years. Like it's not an independent thing. It's truly following from real results and using algorithmic insights from these fields. So anybody in these fields hopefully would find it particularly interesting in that way, as well as just like whether it's a good experience socially. I'm just going to end by just showing you a few pictures, and then I'll conclude it. So you could find it here. It's downloadable, or you can use it on the web. It's heymaven.com if you want to try it out. It's already available. It's only been out for a couple months, so it's very, very new. And we're at the beginning, but it's there, and you can give it a try. This is what it looks like. You can see like that you follow interest. You can see your interests here at the top. This is a feed. The feed looks a little bit Twitter or X-like, but it's not like obviously under the hood. Like for example, you can see there's nothing about likes and nothing about follows. And what you can see actually is that, oh, sorry, let me point this out, that like here under this piece of content, these things in red are actually interests that have been extracted by AI. And so as ideas are exposed to you, their corresponding interests are exposed to you, which allows you to add those to your set of interests, which are at the top here, which is kind of like expanding your serendipity surface as you discover new things to explore. And you can see that like each interest has its own profile. So we were thinking like people are used to following something. They follow people, but here we can make profiles for interests. So then you can follow them. So you can follow, like this is a particular interest in synthetic biology. It's got a profile like a person would on X. You know, there's the little bio for it. And you can see posts that are related to that. You can see followers, you can see suggested interests. These are things that are within the interest graph that we've extracted from the service that are corresponding to this. So you can explore around. And the system works through intelligence. So it's not like, this is not like a forum like on Reddit where like you would just like go to a subreddit and like everybody here is just looking at this. The system will figure out if a post would be interesting to you if you're following this on its own. So you don't post to this, you just post and you don't worry about it. And it will sometimes slightly broaden. So it'll say, okay, if you're interested in synthetic biology, this thing about biology, you also might be interested in. So it's constantly intersecting people with different interests with each other. So it's not like siloed like forums. Yeah, you can see like there's no likes and no follows. And if you go to somebody's profile, you don't see any follows. It's not like that. People do have profiles. You can look at their profile. You just see their interests. And you could see actually like the ones that are in red are the ones that he has that I don't have. And the ones that are in gray, they're the ones that we share. So this kind of gives me a sense of like how aligned I am with this guy in terms of his interests. Yeah, actually we tried to like make that fun in a way. Like we showed like if you go into notifications, you can actually see like it lets you know if you helped someone find a new interest. Like it says that like this guy here followed this interest neural representation from my post. So I can take credit for getting him interested in that and feel proud of myself. Or sometimes they follow an interest from your profile, like over here. All right, so basically it's a unique social network that's not based on attention, and it's gonna escape life in this endless popularity contest that we're so used to now, aimed at serendipity, inspired by open-endedness, and happy to take some questions now.
Ah, that's great. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. That was honestly incredibly motivating and very inspiring. I feel like one of those artists where I feel very validated. So thank you so much for that. And I want to make sure, because we have a lot of people who are watching on YouTube right now, and I want to make sure, and we also have some questions in the Slido as well. So just a reminder to people who are watching, if you have a question, please pop them either in the chat or on the Slido. So I'm going to go ahead and pop on over to the Slido, and I'm just going to ask the questions in the order that they appeared. So the first one is from Christoph, and he, let me go ahead and highlight this. Yep. So what do you think about the free energy minimization as the ultimate meta or / non-objective?
Okay. I think that free energy minimization is the ultimate non-objective. Yeah, it's an exploration incentive. It's related to ideas like intrinsic motivation. In other words, it's related to all of the fields that have tried to imagine incentives for exploration that would lead algorithms down interesting paths. But I think that of all of the branches of AI, machine learning, even alife, that like this idea of what's interesting is one of the hardest nuts to crack of all. So I don't think this is probably sufficient to answer all the questions we might have about what is interesting. Because like what I think we need to do from a non-objective point of view is to follow the path of the interesting. And it's an ill-defined path, right? And the point is it's actually different for every single person. Like what is interesting to me is not the same as what's interesting to you. But what it does do, what the path of the interesting draws on, is our entire lifetime of experience. It's basically a function of all of human intelligence and all of human experience in a single lifetime, and all of human intelligence that's brought from our evolutionary past as well. And so I tend to think that a relatively simple distillation of the concept of interestingness will not capture all the richness and nuance that is held within that kind of paradigm, that eventually it will be necessary to grapple with life itself, like the idea that you need to have a life to understand what's interesting, and you need to have experienced the richness of a lifetime. I do believe that abstractions are useful on an algorithmic basis in the meantime. So, like novelty search was one of like the ultimate abstractions. It's in that it's extremely simple, like relative to interestingness. It just says it has to be novel. By the way, it's still complicated in the sense that like you have to define what is novel then, but it's much easier to define novelty than it is interestingness. And so novelty is just one attempt to get an abstraction that induces the path of the interesting. And it's worth doing, so I'm not against this. Like, I mean, obviously I did that one, and it's worth pursuing others because of the fact that we aren't there yet in terms of actually being able to represent a human level understanding of what's interesting. And so something like the free free energy principle is important, I think, because abstraction is very important here. It's part of the puzzle, but on top of that abstraction, I think there's more information that's necessary. And eventually you have to deal with the fact that it's idiosyncratic. So in other words, there is no single principle that captures the path of the interesting. It's actually a diversity of definitions because of the fact that we don't share the same interests as each other. So there's no one way to actually pose it. It's the diversity of all those interests that allows the open-ended system to be successful. You know, because you're going to find stepping stones that I wouldn't find because you have different interests, but then I'll find the things that you found interesting and they'll lead to things that I discover in the future. So I need you to have different interests than me, or else I won't get the stepping stones that you provide me. And so we all have to have different interests, or else the open-endedness of the process of civilization cannot continue. And so I think ultimately we have to grapple with that, and we cannot just ultimately end at an abstraction.
Yeah, good point. I'm going to pop on over to another question from another user. And this is a concentration of participation on particular users in Maven, or are the conversations spread across? Is that actively incentivized in the network?
Well, we do see some concentration, but it's not because we want there to be a concentration. It's really because of what's called in the industry the cold start problem, you know, which is the problem that how do you get started as a network of people when there are no people in the network? Obviously, a very difficult problem for any social network that's trying to start out. And so you have to consider that when you start out like in a situation like that, it's absolutely essential that people who come in have somebody to talk to, right? So like if I took an arbitrary group, like a random sampling of 100 people, and they all have different interests, I could say that there are diverse interests on the system, but none of them will talk to each other because they don't actually intersect. So we have a problem. Basically, it's a kind of a paradox here again. And so even though that's like the idealistic case, is that we do want diversity, we have to start out with some clustering in order for the system to get off the ground. And there's some theory that like you could, if you start out with some cluster of interest that like overlap to some extent, they can gradually expand out, and that way you'll be able to grow out from there with this like hot core. Of course, we could have more than one cluster, like there could be a few clusters, and in practice, we probably do have a couple clusters of interest, but we don't yet have the full diversity of human interests. But that's, of course, what we want eventually. Like that would be the ambition of the system, is to really get to the full diversity of interest. I don't want to just be an alife discussion forum or an AI discussion forum. I want to capture everything, because just imagine what that world would be like if just like anything that you could possibly be interested in is immediately at hand with people there who want to talk about it to you. That's the world that I'd like to create. That's like the thing that I thought the internet could have been. Which I don't actually think it is right now, that you get real engagement. You know, I'm not talking about that you could just follow some expert in a field, which is nice. Obviously, I don't think that's a bad thing that you can do that. But I'm talking about like, I actually want to talk about my thoughts here with people who will engage with me and care. The ability to do that across all possible interests and discover new interests would be amazing. But we have to start somewhere. So because of that, we tend to have some clustering at the moment, probably clustering in the field of AI, alife, general technical people. Like that's, you know, a natural side effect of that's like the kind of people who myself and my co-founders, Jimmy Secreton and Blas Morris, like our networks just happen to have those people. So those are the kind of early people who came in. And it's not a reflection of like some philosophical preference for that type of person, but hopefully we'll be able to go from that hot core and just branch out over time.
That's great. And I think maybe we have time for one or two more questions, and I'm going to go to the YouTube chat here. And Klaus Karhana says, or he asks, when you say the interests are captured by AI, can you be a little bit more specific or technical about what exactly is meant by that?
Yeah, so like I said, in this system, you don't post to something, you just post. So it has that kind of like advantage or appeal that you have on X, for example, where you just post what you want to post. You don't think about what subforum you're going into or something like that. So the system then has to decide which people are going to see that content. and on something like X, it would be likes and follows would affect who would see what, and depending on which feed they're viewing. But we don't have those things. And so what our system does is analyze your post to figure out who would be interested in it. And what it tries to do is both do this implicitly and explicitly. So the implicit part is just deciding who would be interested in it. So it knows what interests people have, because people have a collection of explicit interests, and it looks at those and sees whether those overlap with your post. That's the implicit part. But the explicit part is that it tries to actually say what the top three, or it's not always exactly the same number, but roughly the top three interests would be that would be associated with the post. One of the reasons it does that explicitly is because it wants to suggest to you new interests. And so like it wants to actually say, well, you might actually be interested in this other topic too. So basically it's recognizing the fact that often people are talking about more than one thing at a time. Like I could be talking about the architecture in San Francisco. Should I be talking to the San Francisco subreddit, or should I be talking to the architecture subreddit? Well, I don't want to have to make this kind of decision. Like what Maven will do is just say, here's the post. It'll go to both because it's talking about both. And you'll see architecture and San Francisco under. And so if I'm in architecture and I'm already interested in it, I'll see that San Francisco also came up here. And I have an opportunity now to think about, well, maybe I'll also be interested in that when there's actually is a high chance, because often interests that go together are also things that people have correlated interest in. And so it's giving this opportunity to expand your interest surface, your serendipity surface, if you will, to be able to be exposed to more things. And we see people doing this. This particular kind of activity or dynamic does occur, where some people just collect interest. It's like a recreational activity. Like they're just exploring the interest graph, finding things that are interesting, adding them to their collection, and so forth, and thereby expanding the things to which they're exposed.
Great. Okay. Awesome.
Maybe I should say, just because I think the questioner probably wanted to know, an AI extracts those interests. So it's analyzed by a large language model, among other things, but a large language model is involved in the analysis of the text in order to extract the interests.
Oh, nice. Yeah, that's a really good use for large language models. Super nice. And I guess we'll do one last question, and then
Sure.
if everybody else, because there's also other questions, and I think that if your question doesn't get asked, then you can go over to Maven and continue the discussion there. So Hiroki Sayama asks, he says that he loves Maven, and he wants to know, do you plan on allowing users to write some scripts to customize their own Maven timelines?
Maybe in the future. We're definitely open to that as a possibility. But we right now need to just understand, do people actually find this overall experience compelling? Like there's a lot of things we'd like to do, but it's kind of contingent on, is this really a place that people can thrive? We've got to demonstrate that first. I mean, we have reasons to need, like we have to satisfy investors and so forth, that like this is a system people want. And so to be able to be freed to pursue all of these interesting possibilities, the first question is like, is this appealing? Like, do people actually enjoy this experience? And so once we get past that, we would explore things like what you're saying. But also just one other small caveat on that. Customization here would not be to the point where we would allow you to sort of reimagine an objective-driven system, of course, like that would violate our theme. And so we wouldn't want to make it so open that like you could actually just recreate a concept of likes and follows and just like basically go from there, and Maven just becomes a generic platform like Blue Sky or something like that. Like we're not interested in that, of course, because we want to maintain this idea that this is actually outside the straitjacket of the objective world. So it would be subject to that idea.
Great. Awesome. Well, thank you once again so much for joining us today. You're such an inspiration to people who are in the alife community, in the AI community, in the open-endedness community, and academics who are interested in startups and companies. And just all around, this was fantastic. And also thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. like I said, if you want to continue the conversation, I highly encourage you to do so on Maven. And with that, this is Cross Labs signing out for today's Crossroads event. And thank you all so much, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.